My Lords, I beg to move that this House do now adjourn. My Lords, it's my sad duty to pay tribute on behalf of the House to the memory of the noble Lord Wilson of Rievaulx. My Lords, like a number of your Lordships, I grew up in the 60s, and many of your Lordships will remember the dominance the noble Lord seemed to exercise over the political landscape in those years. The crude statistics of his political life are, of course, in themselves impressive. An academic Bevanite of precocious brilliance, who became the youngest cabinet minister since the Second Pitt, then leader of the opposition, the youngest prime minister since Rosebery, and eventually the longest-serving Labour prime minister. However, my Lords, these achievements surely do not begin to convey the flavour of his political persona. His skills as a party manager, even to an outsider, were clearly unequalled, and he quite rightly, as I can testify as a novice party manager myself, in an infinitely more junior capacity, rated his achievements in this respect among his greatest. This is perhaps especially true since he had to exercise these skills at a time of very rapid social and technological change. However, my Lords, it is as a parliamentary performer that he perhaps made his greatest impact. His quickness of mind, his command of the telling phrase made him one of the most formidable opponents any Conservative leader could find himself constrained to meet. His mastery of the House of Commons contributed, I would suggest, immeasurably to his ability to manage his party and to the impact he made on the electorate outside. He understood the importance of trademarks in politics, and he used his Yorkshire roots, his love of sport, and even his pipe to create in public and on television a brand image for his party that was as instantly recognisable as it was effective. My Lords, of late, the noble Lord was prevented by a long period of ill health from attending your Lordship's house as often as he perhaps would have liked. However, his interventions in our proceedings between 1984 and 1986 well reflected his special interests. It is hardly surprising, my Lords, for instance, that the begetter of the Open University should have made his maiden speech in this House in a debate on higher and further education. That a former Labour Party leader should in May 1984 have introduced a Wednesday debate on behalf of his party on unemployment, and that an elder brother of Trinity House should have spoken to an unstarred question in 1986 on marine pilotage. My Lords, I have spoken of the noble Lord's public persona. What I had not realised until I joined the other place in 1979 was what an agreeable personality he was too in private. I had first met him when he received an honorary degree from Liverpool University at the hands of my grandfather, but my only memory of that occasion is his remark that he had never expected to find himself sitting to the right of Lord Salisbury. However, his willingness to reminisce in the smoking room with a new Tory member like myself was delightful, and to me his talk was wholly absorbing, and I for one shall always be grateful for the courtesy he showed me then. My Lords, the noble Lord was one of the leading public figures of our age and a most distinguished public servant. He deserves our tributes today, and the rest that he now enjoys after a difficult last illness is one which we of all people should not begrudge him. May I also finally, my Lords, pay tribute to his family, and in particular to Lady Wilson, who looked after him devotedly in his last years and was a constant support to him throughout his political life. My Lords, our respectful sympathy goes out to them this afternoon.
My Lords, it's a privilege to join with the noble Lord, the Leader of the House, in this tribute to my noble friend, the late Lord Wilson of Rievaulx, one of the defining Prime Ministers, I think, of the past post-war era, and a great parliamentarian. Much, my Lords, will, and indeed already has, been written about him and his achievements, and assessments have already been made of his career. It is, I think, however, hardly possible yet to make any final or definitive judgments. My Lords, they will have to be done by future historians, not by present-day politicians. Unlike his predecessors, Harold Wilson's election in 1964 did represent a clean break with earlier traditions. His father was a working chemist in Huddersfield, the heart of the Industrial Revolution, and he was the first Englishman outside the traditional middle or upper classes ever to become Prime Minister. The other two premiers of humble origins, Lloyd George was of course Welsh, and Ramsay MacDonald was of course very Scottish. But Harold Wilson, my Lords, was invincibly and unashamedly English, and a Yorkshireman at that, from his accent to his attitudes. He had a powerful combination of physical toughness, a brilliant mind and memory, and a strong sense of social justice, qualities which I think stood him in very good stead throughout his active political life. Now, all of us, I think, particularly perhaps those of us on this side of the House, have our own memories of him. Now, I'd only mention two notable qualities. First of all, my Lords, his determination to do everything he could to keep the Labour Party united. He once said this, he said, "This party is a bit like an old stagecoach. If you drive it along at a rapid rate, everyone aboard is either so exhilarated or seasick that you don't have a lot of difficulty." My Lords, he devoted much time and great effort to ensuring that no one, in fact, did fall off. Secondly, his personal kindness. I think many of us in this House today, myself included, can testify to that. He was remarkably thoughtful and considerate for others, a quality not invariably, my Lords, associated with high office. His successor, my noble friend Lord Callaghan of Cardiff, is unfortunately in Tokyo. My Lords, he has sent me a message which, with the permission of the House, I would like to read. And he says this, he says, "Harold Wilson's passing will be deeply mourned by all of us who knew him personally, and also by countless others who never met him, but for whom in their youth he represented their ideals and aspirations. All of us send our deepest sympathy and regrets to Mary and his family. His purpose in politics was to remove the disfiguring evils of poverty and to create a caring society with equal opportunity, open to advancement and in tune with the changing needs of his time. He was proud to have been responsible for the birth of the Open University. He was by nature a conciliator and the least self-assertive of men, but he fought with the doggedness and the determination of a true northerner when he had to. Now, these qualities and his high intelligence, kindness and approachability helped to spread his influence over a much wider area than his own party. It was a natural expression of this to be a passionate opponent of apartheid and of racial discrimination. He was the most successful leader that Labour has ever had, winning 4 elections out of 5, although on each occasion he came to office at a time of great economic difficulty. Above all, Lord Callaghan concludes, he was a devoted servant of his cause and his country. And also, I'm sure the House would wish to echo those sentiments and to send our deepest sympathy to Lady Wilson, his family, and all who were close to him.
My Lords, I had a long working relationship with Lord Wilson, which at times was very close. It was not without its ups and downs. He and I came from different strands in the sometimes conflicting fabric of the Labour Party. It was therefore a sign of his tolerance and his generosity that he gave me the great opportunities which led to my working so closely with him. And I have found that well before his death, it was the ups rather than the downs which came to dominate my memory. In the same way, I believe that in the last few years, which have been very sad ones from the point of view of his activity, have nonetheless been balanced by being good ones from the point of view of the justified recovery of his reputation. He will stand in history, my lords, as a considerable Prime Minister. I, however, shall remember him, above all, for his courtesy and his kindness. He hated being disagreeable, and he liked being nice to people, which is not always the case with those who had his thrust to power. He also had very good nerve in a crisis, and as he experienced quite a lot of crises, that was a big asset. In some ways, he was better, easier to work with when things were going wrong. He was cool and unrecriminatory. I conclude, my lords, with one last thought. He was one of the very few Prime Ministers voluntarily to surrender office, to go without the intervention either of debilitating illness or the withdrawal of confidence by Parliament or country. In this century, he and Baldwin stand alone in this respect. And it was the more remarkable because he always appeared so dedicated to and concentrated on politics. As a result, some fantastical theories were developed about the reason for his going. I've always regarded them as nonsense. Much more likely, I think, is that he had some faint early intimation of the fading of his great powers of memory, speed of comprehension, and zestful ingenuity, and decided that he had better go. If so, it was a noble decision of rare insight and self-discipline. He served his country well and was determined that it should only be at the height of his powers. Our sympathy goes out to his family, and in particular to his wife, whose devotion in a long twilight has been visible to all of us.
As one who owes his entire ministerial career, brief though it was, to Harold Wilson, I was in fact appointed to his government by him, promoted to his cabinet by him, and fired by him. And I was therefore grateful to have been invited to add our tribute from these benches to a quite extraordinary political figure, and to express our sympathy to Mary Wilson, to whom he owed a very great deal indeed. He was indeed a very considerable political figure. He was also an extremely complex human being. He was regarded by many commentators as a little bit of a political fixer. My lords, that grossly underestimates his abilities. He was a prince among political fixers, and indeed that was something which was necessary for our political system almost above all else at that particular time. When he took office in '64, he did so with a wafer-thin majority, with a party which was split from top to bottom. He was surrounded by powerful colleagues whose admiration and affection for him was, to say the least, somewhat muted. That he kept that mutinous crew together and went on to win the '66 election was due almost entirely to his political skills with such a small majority. And I do not believe that anyone else could have done it at that time. But although he could be a very tough political operator, he was on a personal level, as others have said, a very warm and concerned being. I remember an occasion when a lobby correspondent whose writings were pretty critical of him, had therefore been placed very high on Harold's blacklist, was rushed to hospital with a very serious illness. And one of his first visitors that same night was in fact the Prime Minister, who cancelled appointments because he wanted personally to wish him well in person. And those acts of kindness of that type were by no means unusual, though obviously they were never widely known. Like all Prime Ministers, he presided over his fair share of disasters, but I have no doubt that historians will find them eclipsed by the positive contribution which he made to the political life of this country. On a personal level, all of those who knew him have an enormous store, which they treasure, of Harold Wilson anecdotes. And I believe over the years, of as long as we live, those who did, will continue to pin people in corners and repeat those anecdotes to them. And as we do, I think the one thing that we would all have in common is that we do it with a very affectionate smile.
My Lords, I also rise to express my condolences with some sadness this afternoon on the death of the noble Lord Wilson of Rievaulx. And it is a sadness that relates not simply to his death, but to the sad circumstances leading up to it over difficult months and years preceding it. And I express my sympathy to his wife, Lady Wilson, and to their family over that period. The noble Lord was a character who made a great mark on society. I cannot claim to be someone who knew him personally, but as an observer, I can say it seems to me that there were particular characteristics about him which are worthy of comment, and perhaps the most notable one is that he managed to combine two particular virtues very closely together. One was idealism, and the other was a pragmatic awareness of what was politically possible. The pragmatic awareness of the politically possible is something which other noble lords of this House are able better than I to comment on. But the idealism I can at least comment on. For the idealism lay in his particular roots, which were those of strong, nonconformist Yorkshire Christian stock. And that idealism marked his characteristic. That was the idealism which surely led him into his great concern for social justice, which was expressed both in his time as Prime Minister, but also in those earlier years when, as a young man, he worked with Beveridge on setting up the welfare state. His relationship with the Church was one which was of particular importance to me. And of course, as Prime Minister, he had particular responsibility over the election of bishops who would ultimately end up on this bench. I quote from a private letter which he wrote, "The duties I have in respect of the established church are not just your or my business, but the business of everyone. And these are duties which I take most seriously." My Lords, it is not without it is certainly worthy of comment that it was during the noble Lord's premiership that two most notable members of the bench in front of me were appointed, being Donald Coggan of Canterbury and Stuart Blanche of York. And I think the Church and society have much to thank him for in those appointments. My Lord, I, with other members of this noble House, pay my tribute to him. May he rest in peace, and may those who mourn him find their hope in the faith once delivered to the saints.
Lords, I hope the House will forgive me intervening in the tributes. I do not speak for the crossbenchers, that speech has been made. But 50 years ago, Harold Wilson and I and Lord Callahan of Cardiff entered the House of Commons together. Europe was shattered. We had higher hopes of building a better world. There was a remarkable comradeship in the House. I was new from the valleys of Wales. I had so much to learn, and I soaked it in, the respect there was across the floor for the opinions of other people. One of Lord Wilson's characteristics was that he always had an enormous personal regard for the beliefs and opinions of other people. We little dreamt in '45 that he would be Prime Minister when I was elected Speaker of the House of Commons. I had the privilege of serving with 3 Prime Ministers. Lord Wilson was the first. Lord Callaghan of Cardiff was the second. And the noble Baroness Thatcher of Finchley was the third. I had had a warm friendship with the Wilsons, but the minute I became Speaker, he respected the office. The friendship endured. There never was any pressure of any sort. My heart is full because I know that we are paying tribute to one who loved this land, was proud to belong to it, and the noble prelate referred to his nonconformity. Lady Wilson is the daughter of a congregational minister. They were married in Mansfield College at Oxford, and I know how much their faith meant to them. And like everyone else, my heart has ached in these past years as I have looked with love and admiration at the care given to him in his closing years. An example for the whole of our country has been set by Lady Wilson. May I say, by way of conclusion, we who live in Wales have a special reason to be grateful, for it was he, the Yorkshireman, who established the office of Secretary of State for Wales. James Griffiths was the first Secretary of State for Wales. The second was Lord Cledwin of Penrose, and I was the third. But James Griffiths used to tell us he had only pen and paper in that office, but it has been built till today. It's on a par with the Scottish office. And just as the world salutes him, salutes his memory for the Open University, the people of Wales have cause to salute him for opening the doors for a new era so far as the Welsh people were concerned. I always found him to be a man of his word, and that is because he was a man of his faith, and I thank God that his life influenced mine.
Motion is that the House do adjourn.